Fred Kelly here, your nerd sidekick. In this video, I'm going to give you 9 ways that you can add USB ports to your computer. Whether you have a laptop or a desktop computer, I've got you covered. There's no need to buy a whole new computer just to add USB ports. I've got all these cool gadgets to show you. Do not be intimidated. I will show you exactly how to use each one of these. This is not a sponsored video. I purchased all of the hardware that you see in this video. So let's get started. First, you'll see how you can easily add ports without having to open your computer. This works with laptops or desktops. The first and easiest option for adding ports is to use a USB hub like one of these. So what is a hub? Think of it as a splitter or like a power strip, except it lets you plug in multiple USB devices such as a mouse, keyboard, printer, or other device. You simply take a hub like this one and plug it into an open USB port on your computer. By doing that, you've instantly added, in this case, 4 ports to the computer. But of course, you have to use a port to plug this in, so I really only added 3 new ports. You can purchase larger hubs with more ports, so consider how many devices you need to plug in before you make a purchase. When you plug in a hub, you might get a beep like you just heard, but you probably won't have to configure anything. These hubs normally do not require the installation of any additional software or drivers. They just work instantly. And just to be clear, I can plug these hubs into this desktop computer just the same as this laptop. And I can plug into any port, whether it's on the back of the computer or on the top of the computer in this case. But I'll plug in over here. Boop, boop. Okay, that was actually just me. This computer is not even plugged in, but you get the idea. You can plug these USB hubs into just about any port on your computer, whether it's a laptop or a desktop. You do want to make sure you plug into the fastest available port, one that hopefully is the same as or greater than the speed of the hub itself. And now I can plug in some devices. For example, this mouse. And you can see it does move the mouse on the computer. Or I can plug in a flash drive. There's that flash drive that I just plugged in. Or I can plug in this USB powered light. And you can see that there. Or something different like this barcode scanner. And you can see it's powering up. If I scan this, and you can see it immediately put that barcode right here. So you can plug in just about any device you want into one of these USB hubs. Now, one important consideration is how and where physically you'll use the hub. If you're connecting to a laptop like this, a short cable should be fine. A hub like this one is perfect for plugging in right next to the laptop. However, if you have a desktop computer that sits on the floor or several feet away from where you are working, this short cable is probably not adequate. And notice that this cable is permanently attached to the hub. You can't plug in a longer cable. There are USB extender cables, but if you know you want the hub to sit conveniently in front of you while connected to a computer several feet away, consider a hub like this one, which comes with a longer cable. Plus, this cable is removable, so should you need to replace it with an even longer cable, that's easy to do. Now, by the way, links for all of these items that you see in the video are in the description below. Now, one thing to mention here is that you should not confuse a USB hub with a USB charger. You can see it has multiple ports on it. This is only made to charge or power devices like a cell phone or a tablet. This does not let you connect your devices to your computer. You can't use this to move data between devices with this charger. Now, before we go too far, let's make sure that you understand the difference between the various types of USB ports you may find on your computer. It's important to make sure you plug into the right port. Every USB port has a version number or standard. Chances are good that your computer has a combination of USB 2 and USB 3 ports. So what's the difference? Well, primarily it's the speed and power delivery. Without getting too deep into the details, what you need to know is that USB 3.0 is roughly 10 times faster than USB 2.0. And some versions of USB 3 may be 20 or even 40 times faster than USB 2. And the different versions of USB deliver anywhere from just 2.5 watts to as much as 100 watts of power or even more. To go one step further, there are different USB port types or shapes. The two most common port types you will find on your computer are type A. That's the rectangular ports like these here. These are the ports that you just aren't sure which way to plug in something, and then you always plug it in the wrong way on the first try. And then there's type C. These are the newer, smaller ports that are reversible, meaning you can plug a device in either way and it should just work. There's a whole bunch of other USB protocols and port types, but I'll leave that for another video. Now, most of these USB hubs are made to connect to a USB 3 type A port. So how can you even know or tell the difference between a USB 2 and a USB 3 port? USB 2 ports are typically black or white, while USB 3 ports are often blue. However, unfortunately, there is not an absolute standard that all manufacturers follow. So you can't depend on the port color to determine the speed. If in doubt, check your manual or the spec sheet for your product online. You can also look at the port itself. Next to the port, you should see a logo that tells you what type of port it is. Looking at the back of this desktop computer here, you can see the various USB ports. This three-pronged trident logo tells you these are USB 2.0 ports. These ports max out at just 480 megabits per second. These are great to use with devices that use very little data, for example, a mouse or a keyboard. Now, this next logo adds the letters SS next to the trident logo. SS stands for super speed, and these ports operate at 5 gigabits per second, 10 times faster than USB 2.0 ports. And there are even ports with numbers in the logo. This teal-colored port has a 10 next to the trident, indicating this is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 port operating at up to 10 gigabits per second, and this is the typical speed for teal-colored ports. You might also see the SS with a plus next to it rather than the number 10. SuperSpeed Plus is also a 10 gigabit per second port. And this USB-C port has a 20 next to it, meaning it operates at up to 20 gigabits per second. Now, it's important to know that sometimes the logo next to the port does not follow the recommended logo guidelines, at least according to the USB Implementers Forum, which is an industry group that maintains the standards for USB. This trade group charges a licensing fee for certification of USB devices as well as the logo use. So I believe that manufacturers are just creating their own logos to avoid paying these fees. So just be aware that your USB port may not be labeled with a standardized logo. So if in doubt about port speed, consult the documentation for your computer. When you install a USB hub, be sure to plug the hub into the fastest available port so that all of the devices you plug into the hub will be able to take advantage of the much faster USB 3 speed. Of course, if the hub itself maxes out at, say, 5 gigabits per second, you won't benefit from plugging into a 10 gigabit port. Any devices plugged into the hub will only operate at up to 5 gigabits per second. The second way to add USB ports to your computer is with a powered USB hub. These first two hubs that we looked at did not require power from a separate power adapter. All USB ports do deliver power to the devices that are plugged into them. However, you may run into issues if you need to connect multiple devices that require large amounts of power, for example, an external hard drive or a solid-state drive. A USB hub that is not powered externally is bus powered, meaning that it gets all of its power from the standard power delivered to a USB port through the bus from inside the computer. You can think of a bus simply as the communication system that transfers data and power, like a bus taking kids to and from school. In fact, the B in USB means bus. To avoid power issues, consider getting a powered USB hub like this one. These will cost a bit more, but not much. They will work the same as the first two, but you will need to plug in the power adapter. If you're using a non-powered USB hub and find that some devices just don't work or behave strangely or irregularly, you probably need to upgrade to a powered USB hub. Now, while you can use either of these hubs on any kind of computer, the first type of hub without the added power adapter is perfect for on-the-go users on a laptop who need a quick, compact, easy setup without having to access external power. The powered USB hub is especially good for desktop computers, for users who want to set up a number of power-hungry devices and then plug everything in and then just forget about it. Before we move on, I should mention what you may be wondering. Can you daisy chain or plug a hub into another hub and still get USB ports to work? Well, the answer is probably up to a point. USB does have limitations. It can be 7 tiers deep with the USB host controller that provides USB capabilities in a computer being at the top at tier 1, and then connected to this host controller will be downstream hubs. Then you plug in one of these external hubs, but then these external hubs typically have another tier of hub inside them. So you may be able to plug in another hub. Then finally, you would plug in the actual device like a mouse. So anything beyond tier 7 just won't work. So in all likelihood, you can daisy chain at least 2 of these, but beyond that, you may find that the devices just don't work when you plug them in. Now I'll plug in this hub into my laptop. Then I'll plug this second hub into the first one. Then I'll plug this third hub into the second one. And look what happened. Windows tells me that there are too many USB hubs. You'll probably never come close to doing this, but be aware that it is possible to exceed the capabilities of USB. That brings me to the third way you can add USB ports to a computer, a laptop docking station. Docking stations like this one here make it easy to connect a laptop to multiple external devices. They're very helpful for people who travel with their laptop, but who also like to come back to an office and quickly connect to multiple devices like a printer, an external drive, and a couple of extra monitors. And you can even connect to a network with one of these. In the 40+ years since laptop computers were first introduced, they have undergone massive changes. They've gone from large devices, almost as big as a desktop computer, to the lightweight, barely there devices that we have today. This tendency toward downsizing laptop computers has created the need to move some of the functionality previously built into laptops to an external device. For example, some newer laptops no longer have an Ethernet port, and they also may have fewer USB ports, or they are only being equipped with USB-C ports. In the past, laptop docking stations were brand specific, meaning they would only work with one brand and even just one specific model of laptop. Only laptops made specifically to work with a docking station could take advantage of this. The docks were large and clunky, like this one from HP. This would be set up on a desk, likely in your office. And on the back here, you can see there are 4 USB ports. There's 3 ports for adding additional monitors to your computer. There's an Ethernet port, audio ports, and a place where you plug power in. So you would just set that on your desk. And then I have an HP laptop, and on the bottom of that are the holes where these connectors are right here, where this would lock in. So we could just drop that down onto the dock, and that locks in. And I'll push this, and then that has a proprietary connector that allows this laptop to immediately begin taking advantage of any of the peripherals that you might have plugged into this dock. Today, these brand-specific docking stations are giving way to these simpler USB-based docks that will work with any computer, not just a specific brand. You could say that these new docks are almost the same as the USB hubs that we looked at earlier, except that they just take the capabilities up a few notches. This docking station, for example, lets you add up to 8 additional USB ports, but it also lets you add an Ethernet port for connecting to a wired network. Plus you can add 2 monitors via HDMI and another display port. And then I can even connect to speakers or headphones with this. All this is connected through a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 port. This uses the USB Type-C connector, so you will need to make sure that your computer has a USB 3.2 or higher port for this docking station to work fully. And the port needs to also support DisplayPort video for the video ports on this to work. To use these new docking stations, you simply plug into a USB-C port on your computer. These docking stations also provide much larger amounts of power than other types of USB hubs because the USB version they use delivers up to 100 watts of power. So an external power supply is usually not necessary with these. Now, in a separate video, I use this docking station to demonstrate how to connect multiple monitors to a laptop. You can click up here or in the description below to see that video. And now I'll plug devices into this docking station and show you what it can do. Ethernet cable to connect to the network. 32-inch 4K monitor via DisplayPort. Smaller monitor here via HDMI cable. Third monitor via HDMI cable. Adding a mouse through this USB 2 port. Adding a keyboard through another USB 2 port. This old laser printer by USB. And let's print something. And here's a flash drive through USB. And there's that drive right there. This old external hard drive through USB. And there's that external hard drive right there. And this webcam on the USB port on the back side here. And this flash drive that uses USB-C. And there's that USB-C drive right there. And last but not least, I've got an NVMe drive in this enclosure. This is super high speed. I'm going to plug that into this USB, the last USB-C port on the back. And here's that last drive that I just plugged in. And you can see all of these devices plugged into this one docking station. You can leave these plugged in all the time and come back to your desk and just plug in one cord and you've got all these devices connected immediately. Let's turn now to ways you can add USB ports to your desktop computer. If you've never opened your computer, don't worry. What I'll show you is very easy to do. There's no technical knowledge required. Just follow along and you'll be able to add more USB ports to your computer. Now first, power off your computer and unplug it to be safe. Then press the power button to discharge any remaining power in the system. Next, take the cover off the case. If you're facing the front of your computer, remove the cover from the left side. And you may need to remove a couple of screws in the back. And if you have glass panels for doors, just lift the glass up off the hinges and store the glass door carefully. So the next several ways to add USB ports to your computer will require a close look inside your computer. Your computer has a motherboard, very much like this one. That's the foundation upon which all of the circuits and components of your computer are built. You're going to have one here. In this case, it's back behind most of these parts here. You can't really see it. And most motherboards will include USB connectors or headers. And these headers let you make USB connections inside your computer case. Or you can also connect these internal connectors to external ports like these here on the top of this computer. Sometimes when a computer is being built, these external ports are not connected either on purpose or accidentally. So if you have a port like one of these that does not work, fixing it may be as simple as finding the loose cable inside your computer and connecting it to the motherboard. All of your external ports may be working now, but there's still a chance that you have even more connectors on the motherboard that you can use to add USB ports. When I built this computer back in 2019, I did not use all of these internal connectors. At the time, I just did not need them. But today I've got additional USB devices that I'd like to connect. So I'm going to show you 5 different options you can use to add ports by connecting to the USB connectors on your motherboard. First, you'll need to locate the USB connectors in your computer. Now, if you still have the manual that came with your computer, like this one, that can help you locate the USB connectors. Or you can just download the manual from the manufacturer's website. In the manual, there will probably be a table like this one. It shows a list of ports. Look for port names that include the letters USB in them. And you should also have a diagram of the motherboard, like this one here, that shows you where those USB port connections are. There are 3 USB port connector types commonly found today on motherboards. These connectors are standardized, so your port should look the same no matter what manufacturer made your motherboard. First is the USB 2.0 header, which looks like this. USB 2.0 was released in the year 2000. By today's standards, these ports are slow, maxing out at just 480 megabits per second, but still useful for devices like mice and keyboards, which use very little data. My motherboard has 2 USB 2.0 headers. This one here is already in use, as you can see, connecting these 2 ports on the top of the case. But this other header here, right here, is unused, so I could use that to connect and add ports to the computer. I'll show you how in just a moment. Second are these USB 3.2 Gen 1 connectors. This USB version was originally released as USB 3.0 in 2008 and subsequently renamed to USB 3.2 Gen 1. These ports are called Super Speed USB. They provide up to 5 gigabits per second of data throughput, making these ports 10 times faster than the USB 2 ports. My motherboard has 2 of these connectors, as do many other motherboards, so don't miss the opportunity to use both of these ports. This one here, way back in there, you can see there's a blue cable in there, is already connected to the external ports on the top of the case, but this one down here is available. Third are these USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C connectors, which max out at 10 gigabits per second. USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports were originally released as USB 3.1 in 2013. My motherboard has just one of these connectors and it is not currently in use, so I can add USB ports with this connector. Modern computer cases will normally have USB ports on the outside, and they will come with cables pre-installed that allow you to connect these external ports to one or more of these motherboard connectors. This case is older, so it only has a USB 3.2 Gen 1 cable and a USB 2.0 cable and associated ports. There are no USB-C ports on this case. One thing I encourage you to do is make sure that all your external ports are connected to the motherboard. All the ports built into the front panel of my case are already connected, but if you have external ports that don't work, it's probably because they were never connected to the motherboard or a cable may have been disconnected accidentally. Look through your case for unattached cables that look like these. If you find one, try attaching it to the appropriate connector on the motherboard and see if the ports start working. That's low-hanging fruit that will give you additional USB ports quickly and without cost. We've looked inside the computer, but how can you add external ports? There are 4 locations where USB ports are found on the outside of a case. 1 is on the top, 2 is on the front of the case, 3 is on the back of the case on the motherboard itself, and 4 would be these expansion slots down here that would eventually give you external ports on the back. Now, I've already addressed the use of 2 of these. 1 is to make sure you've connected the ports that are built into the top of the case, and 2, we talked about connecting USB hubs. On a desktop computer, you could just simply plug hubs into a port on the motherboard on the back of your computer. So that leaves 2 places where you can add new external USB ports to your computer: the front of the case and the expansion slots on the back. Let's talk about the expansion slots first, since pretty much all computer cases have expansion slots. On the back of your case, you'll find these narrow slots. These openings here provide an area where something on the inside of the computer can be connected to the case, so a device or a port is available on the exterior of the case. These slots line up with the PCI slots built into your motherboard. Here's one of those right here. So for example, if you install a graphics card like this one, on the outside of the case you'll have one or more ports where you can plug in a monitor. Inserting some kind of expansion card into one of these motherboard slots is the most likely reason you will use an expansion slot on the outside of the case. And we will examine this shortly as a way to add USB ports. However, not all devices that utilize one of these expansion slots on the case have to be plugged into the motherboard expansion slot. In fact, 3 of the slots on the case down here at the bottom, right here, do not line up with a motherboard PCI slot. And that's where we are next going to install some USB ports. So here is the 4th way out of 9 that you can add USB ports to your computer. This 9-pin connector on this cable connects to this expansion slot bracket. And you can see on the bracket are a couple of USB ports. These are USB 2.0 ports. Installing this takes just 3 steps. Step 1, look at the back of your case and pick a slot that is not occupied. These slots may correspond to a slot on your motherboard, but this bracket does not need to be plugged into the motherboard. Only the cable needs to be plugged into the motherboard. In fact, if you can find a slot on the back of your computer that will not be in the way of a slot on the motherboard, that's even better because that will give you future space to install a card in the motherboard. Most computers will have a couple of slots on the back that do not line up with a slot on your motherboard. As I mentioned, there are 3 slots in this computer right down here. Pick your slot and unscrew the slot cover from the case. Step 2, insert the bracket into the slot and screw it into the case. Notice inside the case there's a little hole right here. That little slot, that vertical slot, is next to each of the slots on the back of the case here. And that is meant for you to insert the very tip of this into so that it stays in place. Step 3, plug the cable into the motherboard. Now here is the USB 2.0 header right here that is not in use. Note that this header has 9 pins protruding. The connector on the end of the cable is a female connector that has 9 openings with 1 spot that is not an opening. This prevents you from installing this in the wrong way. You need to match up this missing hole in the cable with the missing pin on the motherboard connector. Push that onto the header. The next time you turn the computer on, it should immediately recognize these ports and they should be working without any further configuration required. These are plug and play, meaning that you should not need to install any additional drivers since those are typically installed with your Windows operating system. The 5th way to add USB ports to your computer is this next expansion slot bracket, similar to the first one, except that the connector on the end of this cable is a USB 3.2 Gen 1 connector. Once again, I will find an empty slot in the back of the computer and remove the slot cover and install the bracket in that slot. Then I'll plug this cable into the USB 3.2 Gen 1 connector. Note that this type of connector provides 2 ways to make sure you insert this connector correctly into the header on the motherboard. First, on the cable's connector, you'll see this little tab right here that sticks out. On the header is a notch where that tab needs to go. Also, if you look at the header on the motherboard, there is 1 pin missing, and on the cable itself, there is a single spot where there is not a hole. Just line the cable up so that the tab goes into the notch on the motherboard, and it should go in perfectly. Again, the next time you turn on the computer, these ports should work without any additional configuration required. The 6th way to add USB ports, if you haven't already guessed, is this final expansion slot bracket that has this USB Type-C connector, I'll install this on the last remaining expansion slot cover that does not interfere with a PCI slot on the motherboard. Then this cable will plug into the USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C connector on the motherboard. It may be hard to tell which way these connectors plug in because they look almost like they are the same on both sides of this connector here. But in spite of the fact that USB-C devices can plug in either direction into a Type-C port, this cable can plug in one specific way only in the motherboard connector. If you try plugging it in and it doesn't click in easily, try turning it around and it should click in. Don't force it. It should not take much force to click it in. And just like the first two brackets that we installed, this one USB-C port should immediately work the next time I turn the computer on. In fact, I'll go ahead and reboot the computer now and double check that all the ports are working. I booted the computer and now I can check these newly installed USB ports. Checking ports is simple. Plug something in and see if it works. So I've got this USB light that I can quickly plug in to the Type A ports. So we'll plug in up here and there you go. You can see that light is working. You can check all these Type A ports real quick. There's that one. And these are the other way around. There's another one and the other one. Or you could use something like a USB powered fan. Great little fan, by the way. It's great on a desk, so plug that in, turn it on.
I am a robot.
Better though would be something that actually exchanges data with the computer, so I can plug in a keyboard or a mouse and see if they work. But the best test will be to see if the port is moving data at a speed close to the rated speed for the motherboard header it is plugged into. So to do that, you'll need a flash drive, something like this, or a solid state drive like this one. This flash drive plugs into both USB Type A and USB Type C, so it's great for testing either one, any of these ports that we've got here. The problem with this is it maxes out at 400 megabytes per second read speed, so it can't go as fast as a USB 3.2 Gen 2 port can go. So to test that, I have this enclosure with a high-speed NVMe drive inside, and this enclosure is rated for speeds up to 10 gigabits per second, and the drive inside can go up to 3 times that fast. So if I plug this into a 10 gigabit per second USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, like the one here on the bottom, then I should be able to get close to the maximum theoretical speed. So I'll plug that into this USB-C port down here. And you can see we have power, so it's on. So this immediately launched us into Windows File Explorer, and there's the drive that I just plugged in. And so what I can do is I can use Blackmagic Design's free disk speed test program to check the speeds of this drive. I can just type in Blackmagic here, and it's already installed, so I just hit enter. So now I can choose the drive that I want to test, select target drive, and choose drive Z, select that. And so now I'm going to start a speed test here, and it will write data to this drive. So it wrote data at 866 megabytes per second, and it looks like it's reading that at about 922 megabytes per second. So this program will just continue to run multiple tests over and over again. But you can see somewhere between 870 and 922 for read and write speeds. That is not getting to the full 10 gigabits per second. That is the potential for this particular type of port that we're plugged into, but it's somewhere in the 7 gigabit range, I think, when you do the conversion from megabytes to gigabits. And so it's not perfect, but somewhere in the chain of all the devices that we've got plugged in here, something is slowing it down so it doesn't hit theoretical speed. And it's often the case that you don't hit the top theoretical speed of a port. And so I'm good with this speed, the 7 whatever gigabits per second that this is running at. For an external drive is a pretty good speed. So just be aware your mileage may vary in terms of the speeds that you're going to get from the different ports that you install based on the motherboard, based on the type of the third-party product that you buy that plugs into that port on the motherboard, any cables that you use, whatever external device you plug into that port. All of those things can affect the ultimate speed that you get out of a particular port. If for some reason ports don't work, double check that you plug them in correctly. If that still does not solve the problem, you may need to reinstall drivers in Windows or possibly from your motherboard manufacturer. You may need to open your motherboard BIOS or UEFI and make sure no USB ports are disabled. You should also check the Windows Device Manager to make sure there aren't any USB devices that are showing a yellow exclamation point. If so, you may need to update the driver. Okay, you've seen 3 ways of adding USB ports using these motherboard connectors. That leaves 2 more ways to use the same ports that we just plugged into. Before I do anything else, I will power off here. All right, I've powered off the computer and unplugged the power supply just to be safe. For these next 2 ways to add USB ports, I need to reuse 2 of the 3 motherboard connectors that I just plugged into. So I'll unplug those 2. I'll leave this bracket here on the top plugged into the USB 2.0 header right here, but I will unplug the USB 3.2 Gen 1 and Gen 2 connectors, and that's this one here. There's that one, and the 3.2 Gen 2 right here. For these next 2 options for adding USB ports, we're headed to the front of the case here. We're going to be using these old school drive bays on the front. This type of upgrade is dependent upon having the right kind of case. Newer cases are less likely to have these openings since the types of devices these bays were used for are less common today. These bays were originally here for floppy drives and CD and DVD optical drives like this one up here at the top. Since those devices are nearly obsolete, case manufacturers have stopped including those openings on most cases today. But if you have an older style case like this one, you're in luck because you can install additional USB ports on the front of the case in one of these bays. Because I unplugged those 2 cables from the motherboard just a minute ago, I can again use those empty connectors to plug in 2 front panel hubs, and that's what I've got here. Both of these hubs are designed to fit into what is called a 3.5-inch drive bay. This opening is actually wider than 3.5 inches, but it's called a 3.5-inch drive bay because these were used with 3.5-inch floppy drives decades ago. So I will need to remove this metal cover down here by sliding off this piece of the case. Then removing this metal piece. And then inside of this is a 3.5-inch slot, and I will also need to remove that. There we go. By the way, you will probably need to remove this side of your case to do the things that we're going to do here in just a moment. You will need to access the other side to be able to attach the devices we're going to install from both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this side of the case right now. Now there is a bracket inside the case that I need to pull out and attach one of these devices to that, and then I'll reinsert that bracket. But to get the bracket out, I have to release it. Now on my particular case, this has a screwless system that allows me to just lock something into place with these switches here on the sides, on both sides. So I have to undo those to release that bracket. So I'll press this here, release that, and come around to the other side, release that, and now I can reach in and pull that bracket right out. I've got this bracket out, and so now what I need to do is secure this front panel to the bracket itself, and that way I can make sure that it's not going to move once it gets into the computer. Now I know by checking something a couple of minutes ago where I need to attach this to this bracket where it needs to be attached so that it sits flush with the front of the computer. So you'll need to just check that for your particular situation. So I'm going to take one of the screws that came with the front panel. All right, so now I'm ready to insert this into this bay here. I'll poke the wire through and reach in and pull that in through the computer. Push that in just a little bit more than it needs to be. That way I can secure this metal cover on the front. And then now I can push this bracket on the inside. I can push it back out. And that's it. So I've locked on either side here. I've locked this bracket in place, and so that will not move. If I push on it, it's in there solid. Now your case will almost certainly be different from the one that I have, so check your case instructions for how you would remove one of these drive bays and also how you would secure something like one of these panels inside the computer. Now on the inside of the computer, I can connect the front panel hub to the motherboard. And since we're keeping score, this is the 7th way to add USB ports to your computer. This first front panel hub will plug into the USB 3.2 Gen 1 connector. And so I'll just push that right on in. This panel also requires power. I have a SATA power cable right here coming out of the power supply, and that will connect to this cable down here. I have it lit up inside so you can see that a little better. Now if you don't have a SATA power connector like this one, you may need to have a converter that lets you convert from Molex to SATA, and you may also have to add, if you have a power supply that allows you to add additional cables, you may have a cable from your kit that you may need to add to your power supply so that you can connect these front panels. And now for the 8th option for adding USB ports, I have this other front panel hub. The second front panel hub is meant to plug into a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C connector. This case only had one bay specifically made for 3.5-inch drive bay devices, so I will have to install this one in one of these larger drive bays here. These are officially called 5.25-inch drive bays. I'll remove one of these metal covers so I can do that. And I have this 3.5-inch to 5.25-inch drive bay converter mounting bracket that will make the panel fit correctly into this bay. One note about this converter bracket, I did have to use some sandpaper to make this opening here wide enough for the USB panel, this panel hub, to fit. These should be an industry standard sized opening, but either the opening is just not wide enough or the panel is wider than the standard. So from reading reviews, I think the converter is slightly too small, but 5 minutes of sanding made the opening wide enough. It is made of plastic, so this was very easy to do. Unfortunately, there are not many alternatives on the market since this is not in big demand these days. Okay, now that that fit is fixed, I'll screw this front panel hub onto this bay converter. Then I'll install the whole thing into the bay inside the computer. You may have noticed on the inside here is a piece of metal that's actually in the way, and sometimes manufacturers will make this a part of the case where it's built into the case, but it's also easily removable. This is something that will break off the inside of the case just by simply pushing on it and fatiguing the metal just a little bit. And that easily broke off. I can discard this now and go ahead and install the bracket into the case. And I can put the case back together. Now I can plug this into a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C connector. This will give you up to 10 gigabits per second of data transfer speed. Now, word of warning, there are front panel hubs available that will connect to this type of header, but the panel only gives a 5 gigabits per second connection. So make sure to verify what you need and what you purchase so you take full advantage of your computer's available port speed. I'll link to these so you can find the right type for your system. So I'll first plug this data cable into the USB 3.2 Gen 2 connector on the motherboard. Remember, it goes in just one way, so push lightly and try it the other way if it doesn't click in easily. One note about these cables, you can see I've got these sticking out and they're in the way. It looks starting to look a little ugly. And if you're concerned about the look of your case, I would definitely take some time to deal with some cable management. And what I mean by that is you could route these cables. Instead of bringing them out this way, you could actually send them to the back side of the case and then bring them out through one of the various holes that would be down here inside your case, so that then the cable is only exposed for a very short distance before it actually connects to the motherboard. So just make sure you do that, and I'll do that before the end of the video and you can see what I did. Next, I'll connect the SATA power cable. Again, you may need to use a Molex to SATA power converter if you don't have a SATA power cable available in your system. Older computers usually have Molex in there for power. Now I do have 3 different examples of power connectors that you may use. So this is a SATA to SATA power splitter. So if you were running out of cables to connect these multiple devices in here, this would give you 2 ways that you could plug something in. And this would be Molex to SATA, another splitter. And again, the one I showed you earlier, the Molex to SATA, just changing from Molex to SATA. I'll provide links to these in the description. When I turn the computer back on, these ports should work immediately. There are no software drivers that I'll need to install. We'll check that after installing this next piece of hardware. So those are the 5 options for adding USB ports with these crazy little motherboard connectors. So let's move on. That leads us to the 9th and final way to add USB ports to your computer: installing a PCI Express card like these. While a USB hub that I demonstrated at the beginning of this video may sometimes be unreliable, I consider these to be the best way to add the most reliable USB ports. These cards plug directly into your motherboard, occupying one of the PCI Express expansion slots. This card has been functioning flawlessly in my computer for many years. I'll be putting that back in while adding a new card today. Installing one of these cards will add ports to the back of your computer. Some of these cards may also have ports that work inside the case, and that means you can route a port anywhere you want, either inside or outside the case. For example, this card has 5 ports on the outside and 2 ports here on the inside. These cards come with a dizzying variety of ports. You can get cards with as little as a single external port or cards with 8 ports. The card I'm going to install today has 7 ports, and they are all external. 4 ports are the Type A port and 3 ports are Type C. You can see that here. Some of these cards may require that you connect power to them, like this one, which connects to a SATA power cable here. Others require no external power source, instead getting their power strictly from the motherboard slot here. Now you should pay attention to the speed of the USB ports. Older cards like this one will just support only 5 gigabits per second. Newer cards like this one will support 10 gigabits per second, or some even have more than that. Of course, when reading specs for a card, verify what speed the ports offer. You'll pay more for a faster card in most cases, but not an excessive amount. You should also pay attention to the type of slot that a card must be installed in. The way the connector is made will dictate what kind of slot the card can plug into. Comparing the connectors for these two cards, you can see they are different sizes. The smallest one, which is an X1 connector, will fit into any PCI Express slot on your motherboard. The bigger one is an X4 connector, and this card will fit into any slot sized X4 or larger. You can see the difference in size when I place one on top of the other. These two older USB expansion cards will fit into what is called an X1 slot, which is the smallest slot here on the motherboard. However, this newer, faster card can't be installed in the smallest slot in this motherboard, but it will go into any of the other slots. Most USB cards will fit in either an X1 or an X4 slot. The number after the X just tells you how many PCI Express lanes are available to a particular slot. PCI Express lanes determine how much data can be moved back and forth to a particular slot simultaneously. A higher number essentially means more data is transferred in the same amount of time. The slot where you typically install a graphics card like this one is an X16 slot because graphics cards output a tremendous amount of data. USB cards don't require anywhere near that much data. To install this card, check with the instructions that come with it. Some may require that you install drivers before installing the card. Other cards may not require installation of a driver as one is already included with your operating system. Drivers are sometimes included on a disk like this, but if you are like many people who no longer have a computer with a CD drive, check the instructions for a web page where you can download the driver. Once you've installed any required driver, shut down your computer and unplug the power supply, then press the power button to discharge any power still in the system. Open your case if it's not already. Next, you want to find an open slot on your motherboard, and you want to try to put the card in the smallest slot so that you don't use a bigger slot that you might need in the future when installing another bigger card. You will probably need to remove a slot cover from the back of the case, so just unscrew that, and you can save the cover for later use if you ever remove the card. Now, just carefully push the card into the slot. And screw the card to the case so it stays in place. When you reboot your computer, you should be able to plug a USB device into the new card that you've installed. So I've got a light here that's working, my fan is working, this flash drive over here is working, this NVMe drive is hitting speeds. I've tested it and it is hitting the speeds that I expected. So that's the back side, this new card. Now I'm going to take a look at the front panels that I just installed. And here on the front side, you can see the two panels that I installed. This light is working. This NVMe drive is working properly. I've tested the speed. It's working well. And down here, we've got the flash drive that's also working, and this fan is being powered. I've tested everything, and the speeds are meeting what I expected. So those are working. And a quick peek inside the case after doing a little cable management. I've cleaned things up just a little bit, try to make it look a little nicer. I've routed some cables on the back side of the case, and I actually eliminated one of the brackets over here and one of the front panels I won't be using. So ultimately, that's what it's going to look like for me. So think about doing a little cable management before you wrap up. So there you have it. You now have 9 ways to add more USB ports to your computer. Pick one or more of these and get started adding your ports. I'm Fred Kelly, your nerd sidekick, making you the technology hero. Thanks for watching.